the freedom to spend in retirement, facing our own mortality, and solutions for lifetime income. All this and more on today's episode of The Wave Strength.
Welcome to The Wave Strength. Innovative pension solutions for a secure retirement. Presented by Pacific Life.
All right, everybody, thank you so much for joining us on another episode of the Wave Strength podcast. We're very excited to have you, our listeners, here today. We have a unique conversation, an important conversation that we're going to be speaking about today. But first, I want to introduce my guests that we have here today. We have Michael Finke and Russ Proctor in studio here today. Michael Finke, let's start with you. Maybe you can share a little bit with our listeners about your background.
So I'm a professor of investments and retirement planning at the American College. I also do a lot of research on retirement issues and investment issues. And I used to be, when I was at Texas Tech University, the head of the Retirement Planning and Living Center there.
Awesome. And just to give you some feedback, the first time I heard you speak, Michael, it was really interesting because you have an ability to connect with people, and I'm excited. I think we're going to hear more about that. Our listeners are going to hear that. But it's really interesting to hear you speak because you really have that ability to connect and to provide the information in a way that, in my opinion, is very easy to understand. So hopefully our listeners are going to get a sense of that as well as we go further into this episode.
Pressure's on.
Yeah, the pressure is on, Michael Finke. No, but thanks, Michael, for being with us. And Russ Proctor, thanks for joining us as well. Maybe you can share with our listeners a little bit about your background.
Sure, yeah. So my background is as a pension actuary, so nobody understands what I'm saying. So hopefully Michael can balance me out a little bit. So I spent about 25 years in pension consulting, doing both defined benefit and defined contribution consulting, and then joined Pacific Life about 10 years ago. So I'm currently assistant vice president in the pension solutions area. And one of my passions really is to see the defined contribution plans, the balances that are building up. How do we help participants translate that into lifetime income? Because I think that's a need for our nation and for the citizens here to manage that money in retirement and make sure they're financially secure throughout their retirement.
Absolutely. And Russ, you have such a passion for that. We've worked together for several years, and it's always exciting to work with you on these new projects. And we're always happy to have you back on the Wave Strength podcast. So let's jump right into our topic here, the need for lifetime income. I mean, such an important discussion to have. And I think we have two excellent individuals to lead that conversation. So Michael, maybe you can start things off for us this morning.
Yeah, I think this is an issue we're both passionate about. And part of the issue is that the way the defined contribution system was first envisioned in the United States, it was a complete accident that it ended up being our default retirement savings instrument for most workers. So it was meant to be a way of deferring compensation for executives. It sort of morphed into a retirement plan that more employees started using. And over the years, what we've done is we've refined different elements of this retirement savings scheme. So we've now reduced the cost of investments. We've made it so that more employees are automatically defaulted into something that makes a lot of sense for them to be investing in, which is a target date fund. So we've refined elements of this system that we started out with accidentally. And now we're seeing the first generation of baby boomers who are reaching retirement, and they have to use this money that they've been saving, and they have to turn it into a lifestyle in retirement. Now, as economists, we know that it's not necessarily efficient to just keep it in investments and use it to fund a lifestyle, that there are more efficient ways to do it. But I feel like the system hasn't yet caught up. So we're ready now for the next generation of retirement plans that incorporate some sort of a transition into taking your saving and turning it into income. Because so many of us, I think, have this saving mindset that it's all about putting people in the right types of funds with the lowest costs, and then that we've done our job. But that's not your job. I mean, because eventually sometime they're going to actually have to use that money to buy stuff. And can you create a transition for them where they start feeling comfortable using the money that they've saved for the purpose that they saved it? I mean, we as a society, we subsidize this system to the tune of $150 billion a year for the purpose of allowing retirees to live better. But we're not there yet. We can do more to make this a better system for the people who are participating in it.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. It's so interesting. Everything was all built to accumulate the money, but no real talk about how you're going to decumulate it. And interesting, I know colleagues of mine that have retired, financially very savvy, built up their big 401k balances, and talking to them right after retirement, that it was a weird psychological shift for them to see their 401k balance growing for 30 years. And then the first month they had to withdraw money out of there to live on in retirement. It was very difficult for that person to do it, even though they knew that's what it was for. But the kind of their own mortality came into view as they thought, okay, now my 401k balance is going down for the first time. And that means it'll eventually run out if it keeps going down, which means I'll eventually die. And what happens if I die, before or after that money runs out? That concern was the first time he really started to think of his own mortality. And that transition point that it seems like it's difficult for a lot of people to face that.
And the whole value of pooling risk through an annuity is that you reduce mortality risk. But how exciting is it to imagine your own death? So this is a problem, I think, and one of the reasons why a lot of people don't annuitize. In economics, we call it the annuity puzzle, which is, all right, we know it's more efficient to annuitize, but why don't more people do it? Well, there's so many psychological barriers to buying an income annuity. First of all, there is the lump sum of money, and you see the lump sum of money get smaller. And then you also have to acknowledge that the reason that you're buying this is because you're not going to live forever, and that you're going to want to spread your money out over time in a way that is going to allow you to spend it without having to worry about running out of money. But that in itself, so many psychological barriers to get over to actually make that transition. Now, when you automated people into a pension, it was essentially the same thing. It was a lifetime income that they automatically contributed to it, and then they got to retirement and it provided them with a monthly income. People were perfectly happy with that approach. Now, I think what we find from my research is that they want some sort of a combination, and they want to have a little bit of control over what combination of investments and lifetime income they have. But ideally, they don't want to have to do it off of investments alone because they just don't understand how much they can spend.
Well, Michael, that's an excellent point, and shameless plug here. We actually just recorded a live action webinar that we're excited to share with our viewers. And Michael was so kind to join us with that with Pacific Life's Ruth Shaw. But Russ, let's get your thoughts on that as well.
Interesting. Some of the things that you're talking about, where we talk about all this psychology of trying to get them to get over that hump to purchase the lifetime income. But interesting, I think you've done research as well in terms of that those people that have that guaranteed lifetime income are actually happier. So it's only the same amount of wealth, but one with guaranteed lifetime income, one without, that there's some evidence that they're actually happier.
Well, they definitely spend more. So what we find is that, first of all, you can place a dollar value on a pension or on Social Security, which is how much would it cost to build that income to the average longevity at today's interest rate. So we can estimate how much wealth you would need to provide the same lifetime income. And then we look at people who have more lifetime income, either through an annuity or a pension or Social Security, and we see how much more they spend. And what we see is that if you have more annuitized income, you spend significantly more than if you have investment assets. In fact, what we see is consistently when we look at people who have a lot of investment assets, they just don't spend the money down because they don't feel comfortable doing it. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was looking through individual cases, and we have what's known as the Health and Retirement Study, which was done by the University of Michigan. 20,000 retirees. We can actually follow them through retirement and see how they're spending money. And there is a woman in there who has $1.5 million in investable assets, and she has consistently spent between $20,000 and $25,000 over the last decade between the ages of 65 and 75. And you ask yourself, why is she doing that? Why has she made the decision to live this way in retirement? Is it because she's just built up a habit? She doesn't feel comfortable spending more than what she's getting from Social Security. And I think a lot of people don't, especially people who are savers. I like to call them ants. Like some people are ants and some people are grasshoppers. And the ants are the ones who always spend less than their income because you're always saving for the future. The parable is supposed to teach us that the grasshoppers are reckless, and the winter comes and the grasshopper doesn't have any food and the ant has lots of food. The idea is that there is this habit of thrift that we develop over time, this Puritan ethic, whatever it is. And then we get to retirement and we ask people to do something which they've never done their whole life, which is actually spend more than their income and see their balance get smaller. And for a lot of us, that's just emotionally difficult to accept, which is why we can't bring ourselves to spend the money that we have sacrificed in order to get this nest egg. And at retirement, we just don't feel comfortable spending that nest egg. That's a big problem. And it's a psychological barrier. And not only is it mathematical, so it is optimal to spend less when you don't have a guarantee that if you run out of money, you're going to have to spend a lot less later on in life. So without that guarantee, you're naturally, optimally going to spend less. So we know that there is an improvement in lifestyle by having annuitization, by taking your lump sum and turning it into an annuity. But even further, I think there is a psychological barrier to spending the money down in retirement. And you also have to think about the grasshoppers at the same time. Because the grasshoppers, they go, they get to retirement, they have no idea. They see this number, I've saved $500,000, woohoo, I can buy an RV. So for them, having some sort of lifetime income gives them a better idea of how much lifestyle they can actually buy with the money that they've saved, because they may not have any idea. They may see $500,000 and think, well, I can probably spend about an extra $100,000 per year, and then it's gone. So grasshoppers in general, when they get an inheritance, they spend it on average over the course of 4 years. And now you're dumping all this money onto their lap at the beginning of retirement. It's not good for them either. So they're, whether you're an ant or a grasshopper, you probably could benefit from having at least a portion of those savings in lifetime income.
Yeah, I think another thing that when I think about that, when we have this big pile of money that we're dumping on people that really have not been trained throughout their life of how to draw that down during their retirement. And then now they have the responsibility to invest that to last their lifetime. So you're asking somebody potentially in their 80s or 90s that has to manage this pile of money to make sure they're getting the right return and that it'll last their lifetime. It's really not a fair thing to ask for your employees to do, to say, hey, we built up this retirement savings, now you have to manage it till age 100 or however long you live. Just not a fair task to ask of anyone, even a financial professional.
It isn't, and the big problem when people get older is that it's like driving, our ability to manage our own money. As we get older, our ability declines naturally, just because our brains change as we get older. And it happens gradually. So we don't notice that it's happening. So, everybody has had this experience of being with an older relative and getting in the car, and then after a couple blocks, you think, wow, I'm in the wrong seat if I'm in the passenger seat, because I did not know that their skills had declined this much. And it's just a natural part of aging, and I think we need to accept that. It is a natural, it's not an insult to say that people in their 90s are not capable of making the same financial decisions that they could in their 60s, it's just reality. So how do we set them up for success so there isn't that possibility of potentially running out if they're making bad decisions? In the pension era, they would just even if they were making mistakes, they would continue to be able to rely on that income. Today, we're asking them to manage a pot of investment assets, which means they have to invest in stocks and bonds, and what we find is that especially as you get older, you tend to make a lot of mistakes when it comes to investing in risky assets, because there is this tendency to overreact to what's going on in the market. You tend to pull money out of stocks when the prices have fallen. You tend to put more money in when the prices have gone back up. There was a great study that was done a few years ago that finds that a lot of older investors underperform the market by about 2 to 3%. And the whole reason you're investing in the market is to get a higher return. And if you're not capturing that higher return, then what's the point of it? So how can we set up a system that automates that process, especially later on in life? Because I think you're right. It's not fair to leave it up to older Americans, older workers to manage this nest egg on their own. They're not experts in this stuff. And even the experts on this stuff have a tough time with it.
It makes me think about when we, how do we make this easier for participants to take advantage of, for employees? Because we see that they're not taking advantage of it as much as we would think they should. If you look mathematically and financially, you'd think there should be more people utilizing guaranteed lifetime income, but we're not seeing it yet. We're seeing it starting to tip that more are interested in it, but not really seeing it happen. This goes back to earlier days in the defined contribution space where not enough people were participating, and we couldn't get people to put 3% in, and we couldn't get them to go to the maximum of the match, and we couldn't get them to invest in the right funds. And then all the defaults that we kind of got comfortable with putting them in have been very successful. And is that something you think would work on the other end of it now in terms of defaults that might work in terms of lifetime income?
Absolutely. what would have been the perfect thing for people to invest in the year 2000 if they're choosing their mutual funds? Well, a target date fund, because it would automatically rebalance as they got older. It was the right mix of risky, it was a high Sharpe ratio portfolio of investment assets at a low cost. How many people actually invested in that? It was like 5% of participants would actually invest in this optimal kind of thing. And then you make it the default, and now all of a sudden over 50% of participants are investing in this thing. Are they happy in it? Yeah, sure. They don't have to mess with it. When we look at how people are doing who invest in these types of default investments versus those who go off the reservation and try to do it on their own, the ones who are not doing anything are doing a lot better. So we have now created a system where someone can do nothing and do a lot better than if they try to do something. So how can we harness this power at the rollover stage? So when someone transitions from working to retirement, how can we take this? Now, this is a new risk too, because it's a new generation of workers who have not had to manage their own investments. There, it's been done for them. And now you just dump this decision on them after retirement. That seems wrong. Like you have to transition somehow. So you have to give them guidance about how much of that money they can actually spend every year. You have to invest it in an efficient fashion. And we know, especially when it comes to investing safe assets, with annuitization, you can spend far more every month than you can spend from, say, bond investments. Because if you try to invest the money and you don't know how long you're going to live, you have to stretch it out until maybe there's only a 20% chance or a 10% chance you're going to outlive your savings. But if you just pool it together in an annuity, you can spend as if you're only going to spend it up to the 50th percentile of longevity, which means you can spend a lot more every year. And that's a more efficient way to do it. And having some sort of a default that transitions workers into maintaining some liquidity in a portion of their investments or a efficient investment portfolio, and providing them some guidance about how much they can pull out of that portfolio, especially now that we're seeing RMDs getting pushed back farther and farther. That was the one source of guidance that a lot of retirees had about how much money they could spend from their IRA assets. That's starting to go away a little bit. So we've got to give them some guidance about how much they can spend from their investments, but we also have to give them some source for a portion of their savings of lifetime income. It is a more efficient way to generate income, especially from those safe investments, but from risky investments as well.
Right, yeah, with having some of that guaranteed lifetime income, it really gives people the freedom to spend, because they're so nervous about what they can spend, how much they have to save. When they know it's coming every month, it gives them the freedom. They can spend all that each month. If it's a vacation, if they want to buy something new, they know that check's coming again the next month. And it's really the peace of mind that creates in people when they know they can spend that and they got more money coming after that. The other thing that you mentioned is as you start to move into defaults, where we know on the accumulation phase everyone's comfortable with defaults now, but also on the decumulation side. So I think some of the research and surveys are showing that we might first think, well, we can't default our employees into that because they won't be happy if we put them into that. But the research is showing that that's not really the case.
Yeah, like 92% of employees have either a neutral or positive or strongly positive opinion about the idea of having more guaranteed income in their default. And that totally makes sense because, nobody who ever got a pension was upset because they have a pension. So having part of their default savings in something that's going to provide them with lifetime income seems universally appealing to employees. I think that's not a barrier. How they're going to respond to that is not necessarily, and there are techniques that you can use to socialize people to the idea that part of their savings is going into lifetime income. You can do that through disclosure. There are other techniques that can be used. So for example, the employer contribution can go into lifetime income as a way of getting people to use what's known as the house money effect to their own benefit. They see that as not their money anyway, so then the employer is providing an endorsement. They tend to follow employer endorsements, so they think, well, yeah, that sounds perfectly sensible to me. But there are things that we can do to make that transition easier. But I think just relying on people to take a chunk of their money and turn it into a lifetime income on their own, that's probably not going to move the needle that much. It's like the offering target date funds and then only 5% of employees actually using them. We've got to give them something to help them move closer to that direction.
Yeah, it does feel like we're starting to get in the tipping point has kind of come where there's more interest in this guaranteed lifetime income. The thoughts of having a default in there is starting to be a little more common in terms of plan sponsors looking at that a little bit more. So it feels like maybe part of the Secure Act, where now they have to show that lifetime income on the defined contribution statements, is making plan sponsors start to think about that a little bit more and want to look into that and offer that to their employees. So I feel like we're at the tipping point where we're just looking for a few little pieces of how do we get the employees over the hump? Is it through defaults or other things? How do we get plan sponsors comfortable with the idea that this is coming, this is something good for them to do and for their employees?
And I think experts in this area do have an impact on policymaking. And what we've seen through the Secure Act is that some of these changes that we all think are the right kind of change, that all of the defined contribution plans are going to move to having more guaranteed income options in the future. It just laying a smoother path, and I think we've done that. We've laid a smoother path where it's easier for employers to make that transition. I'm actually, frankly, excited to see what happens over the coming decade, because I feel like we're entering a new era where things are going to start changing rapidly. The more progressive employers are going to start implement some of these changes. I think one of the most attractive things is that it's going to make it easier for employees to feel like they can transition into retirement. They're going to have greater clarity. If I have enough. The problem with a lot of employees is they've saved a lot, but they just don't feel comfortable making that transition because the market goes down or something happens that causes them to maybe postpone it for another year. This is a way of giving them the clarity to make that jump without fear. And I think that's something that a plan sponsor can offer that is a real benefit to those who are participating in the system.
Yeah. Hey, one last question that I had, just something that we've been thinking about, interested in your thoughts on this, where if you had a participant that could start an annuity and draw that monthly income for a year, but then have the option at the end of the year to decide, I decide I don't want that, I'd rather just cash out and get the lump sum. Do you think that would be attractive, and do you think many would actually take advantage of that, or do you think once they got that monthly income, they would just stick with it?
I think they would stick with it. There is this effect where one way of counteracting this idea of resistance to annuitization is you just try it. Because one of the problems with what's known as the endowment effect is that once we have something, we fall in love with it. So once we have this lump sum value of $500,000, we're in love with this lump sum value. But if we've somehow created this pathway where we give them information and we automate them into it and give them the ability to pull out. I'm a volunteer with a animal shelter in Lubbock, Texas, and one of the strategies that they use is they've got what's known as a home visit. So someone's on the fence about taking a dog, and they say, well, you can just bring it back tomorrow. We'll give you a dog, and it'll hang out in your house for a day, and you'll wake up the next morning, and there will be the dogs. They do a pretty good job of selling themselves. And the same way, I think the guaranteed income does a pretty good job of selling itself. I think once you've gotten accustomed to getting that income over the course of a year, who is going to say no? I want that to stop. It just makes retirement so much easier. I think that's a great way to help. The thing is, the great thing about defaults is anybody can pull out whenever they want. But you create an architecture so that they're more likely to make the right choice. And you nudge them in the direction of what's going to make them happier. And then they're not going to pull out. They're going to be perfectly happy with it.
Yeah, that's what I think. These very complicated, life decisions, when you can financially realize what's probably the best thing for most people, to make it easy for them to get to that point where it's defaulted in. They've always got the chance to opt out because it's not right for everyone. You don't know what other financial resources they have, so it may not be right for them. But to set people up so if they don't do anything, they end up in a place that gives them a nice, successful retirement. So, right. And I think that's really, again, as you mentioned, the next decade, I do see a big change. Really looking forward to, by the end of this next decade, that we see this being more common, and that we see the people of this country that have worked hard for their retirement, that they're actually enjoying it and they're maximizing the amount of money they can spend every month, and not just saving it for their kids. So I'm telling my kids I'm going to try to spend all my money so that they got to fend for themselves.
It's not a bad idea. Yeah, we encourage my folks who are in their coming up to their late 70s right now to, you can't take it with you. Spend it. Enjoy your retirement. I'm one of 8, and so they've had make a lot of sacrifices, and but you do have that opportunity where you become this like you've mentioned with the woman in the survey who, had $1 million plus, but was living on a shoestring. I think we've heard it described before as the bag lady syndrome in some cases. But this has been an excellent conversation. Michael, you're clearly so knowledgeable, and we're so grateful for you to come today and share that knowledge with us and our listeners. And Russ, very grateful also for your help guiding the conversation.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And we'd love to have you both back on the show at some point. Yeah. So thank you for joining us today. And to our listeners, thanks for the opportunity to spend some time with us. I want to encourage everybody to check out the webinar that we produced with Michael Finke and Ruth Shaw with Pacific Life. We want to encourage you to check that out. It's going to be an engaging and wonderful conversation. And thank you again for being with us today. And we hope you have a great day.
This has been another episode of The Wave Strength, presented by Pacific Life. Don't forget to catch us on YouTube and make sure to subscribe. Although this podcast is presented by Pacific Life, the opinions and views expressed are those of the hosts and participants and do not necessarily reflect Pacific Life's views on any of the topics discussed. Pacific Life is a product provider. It is not a fiduciary and therefore does not give advice or make recommendations regarding insurance or investment products. Pacific Life, its affiliates, its distributors, and respective representatives do not provide any employer-sponsored qualified plan administrative services or impartial advice about investments, and do not act in a fiduciary capacity for any plan. Pacific Life refers to Pacific Life Insurance Company, Newport Beach, California, and its affiliates, including Pacific Life and Annuity Company. Insurance products are issued by Pacific Life Insurance Company in all states except New York, and in all states by Pacific Life and Annuity Company. Product availability and features may vary by state. Each insurance company is solely responsible for the financial obligations accruing under the products it issues. This podcast was recorded on July 23rd, 2021.